everybody, welcome to this session. We are going to be talking about the modern inclusion challenges and what leaders in HR need to know to navigate in this lovely year that we're having, 2026. So as anyone who's joined these calls before, you'll know that we record these sessions and the session will be transcribed, and some of this might be used on our socials. If you do contribute and you don't want that to be included on socials, just let us know. That's fine. You can either let us know in the chat, or you can let us know by email later. That's absolutely fine, not a problem. So when we talk about inclusion, the conversation is becoming increasingly polarized. I'm sure you can all agree. On the one hand, we've got pressure for organisations to do more, but and be more accommodating and create workplaces where everyone can thrive. On the other hand, we're hearing increasing concerns from leaders and managers who are struggling to balance support, fairness, accountability, and business performance. The reality is that inclusion isn't getting simpler. So we're navigating increasing neurodiversity disclosures, evolving expectations around flexibility, menopause support, growing focus on gender pay gap reporting, and a workforce that is rightly asking employers to create environments where people can bring their whole selves to work. At the same time, managers are asking really practical questions. How do I support someone who is still holding them accountable? How do I balance one person's needs with the needs of the wider team? When does an adjustment become unreasonable? And how do we create genuinely inclusive workplaces where without lowering standards or creating unintended unfairness everywhere? One day I'll get my teeth in as well and I'll be able to read what I wrote. Today's session isn't about having all the answers. It's about exploring the tensions that many of us are facing and discussing how we can navigate them in a way that is legally sound, commercially sensible, and mostly human. Just so you know, we have taken on feedback about having slides or having visuals. We are going to do that, but it isn't there in this session. So what we'll do is, if you want, we can share this script with you afterwards. At least that prompts you and gives you some sort of thoughts. I'd encourage you to share your thoughts throughout today's session, because I suspect many of the challenges you're facing are the same ones being wrestled with by employers across the creative sector right now, including us. So, a question for you all: what inclusion challenge are you finding most difficult to navigate in your organisation right now? Thinking about that, you can pop it in the chat, or you can speak up, whichever is most comfortable for you. Thinking about that, is it age and sort of different age ranges? We've now got 5 different age ranges in the workforce. Is it neurodivergency? Is it women's health, or is it anything else? LGBTQ community in my region got a little bit of a pop out this week by our delightful councillor. I won't go into politics, but you can read the room. So are we finding that sort of thing difficult to navigate these days? What's hardest for you? Or maybe what's things that your employees might be struggling with and grappling with themselves, and asking the most of? We know we've got some top sort of things that are coming up in our client base, don't we, Alexandra?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Sky, good. Yeah, good. Yeah, that's quite a common one, Sky. So if you haven't read that, Sky says, I guess, different ways that neurodivergent members of staff prefer to work, or like needs, that feels like a bit like a clash. And that's something that we're commonly seeing, actually, playing out. We're also seeing there's a bit of age difference in different generations, of different requirements, and also sort of perhaps more women's health needs popping up. So true or false, an inclusive workplace means everyone feels comfortable all the time? True or false? Give me my worst emoji. Thumbs up if you think it's true. Give me a thumbs down if you think it's false. Okay, that's fine, Hayley. You can just use your emojis or the chat. That's absolutely fine. Okay, false. Nice. Alexandra.
Yeah, agree. Obviously. Yeah, it doesn't mean people are going to feel comfortable all the time, because everybody has different needs, have different views, different beliefs, and so on. It's something that is likely to be touched upon, I think, as we discuss things further around what inclusivity actually means and what employers need to think about when making a workplace more inclusive.
Personally, I think this all fits beautifully into Sky's work around psychological safety. I think this is all about understanding safety and what that means, and leaning into listening and showing compassion to people. Okay, thanks, Hayley. Right. Okay, so we're gonna move on to the next stage. So neuro inclusion. So give me some hands up, or pop in the chat, or whatever way you want to kind of communicate with us. How many of you have been worried about saying the wrong thing when managing a neurodivergent employee? Or if you're in an HR role, have you had a manager come to you with the same concern? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really common, isn't it?
Yeah.
I do think this is there's a big education piece missing here, not just in the workplace, but what starts earlier on, sort of in the university space, about sort of how we all understand everyone, not just about neurodivergent community, but how everyone understands different perspective giving. But anyway, so what are you, or do you think managers are the most afraid of? Causing offence, facing a grievance. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to put this into the chat. Being accused of discrimination, or all of the above. Bear with me. I'm just going to put that into the chat. There you go. Yeah, Hayley. All of the above. Yeah. Sure, it's really difficult landscape to navigate, isn't it? This one as well, and do so compassionately as well. It's hard. So okay, so Alexandra, I'm gonna ask you some questions about this. How do you think employees balance individual adjustments with the needs and experiences of the wider team?
So with this one, I think with the principle here should be that inclusion should benefit the individual without creating any significant disadvantage for the rest of the team. As employers, you have a duty to consider reasonable adjustments where a disability exists, but you've also got responsibility to ensure that workloads, expectations and opportunities do remain fair across the team in general. So really the question should be more, how do we support this employee whilst maintaining a sustainable environment for everybody else at the same time? That's where your good management, regular one-to-ones and reviews, and setting clear expectations really become critical. Understanding somebody's needs right from the start, and doing what you can to support them. So it's having that communication and openness to understand what is going to help and what is going to support that person without putting the wider team at a detriment, essentially.
It's difficult as well, isn't it? Because that's sort of what happens if nothing seems to be helping that individual or those employees, those neurodivergent employees.
I think it's difficult. I think if you're obviously having conversations and they're open and transparent, that employee should be making their own suggestions as to what's going to help them. If some things have been implemented as reasonable adjustments and they're not having the desired effect, there's no outcomes that are improving and so on, I'd question whether occupational health has been involved in the process, because that's going to be key to make sure that you've got something really solid there in terms of recommendations. But also, is it something where this person's just constantly not going to be happy with whatever you're putting in place for them? Are they just somebody who's demanding more and more and more? You do not have to bend over backwards when it comes to reasonable adjustment requests. The key is in the term. Like, it has to be reasonable and it has to be workable for the business. And like we've just said, still fair for everybody else in the business and in the team. So if you are constantly agreeing to whatever adjustments somebody's asking and they're coming at you, every few weeks or so, at some point that's going to become really unsustainable for the rest of the team, and that then becomes unfair. So it's about managing, it's about understanding really where they're coming from, why, if there's a constant need for changes, why all of that was not brought up to start with. So what's changed along the way? Why has stuff that's been implemented not worked so far? And what have occupational health said about it?
There's also something that we find quite useful here. There's I'm going to get my teeth in. Has anyone heard of Nancy Klein here? Anyone familiar with Nancy Klein? No. Nancy Klein is a psychologist who's done loads of research into communication, basically. And she has this brilliant framework of tools really to get better at conversations. It's better at kind of listening. So I'm assuming you've all heard of active listening. Yeah. So basically what she does is she takes it on a step further and she uses something called thinking environments. And what's really useful in the setting with particularly with neurodivergency is helping people see perspective and thinking environments. We've got some products ourselves from this. What's really useful is helping people take perspectives, and there are various ways which we can just help you facilitate that if you wanted to, and we can pop out a guide at some point as well on it. But it's really about perspective taking, and it's allowing everybody to have their voice before you jump in. So it allows people to understand all the different pillars of perspective before someone tries to solve the problem. And by doing that, you can help people understand, particularly in a setting like this, that adjustments have been made for you and we're trying to do something, achieve something, whether that's a project or whatever that might be. And we need you to understand that this is the perspective of why we're doing this. And sometimes that context piece can be missing, particularly with a neurodivergent person. They need a lot more context, and sometimes that can be useful in that setting. So if anyone's interested in that, do pick our brains at some point and I can help you. Reasonable adjustments is something that we get quite a lot of conversation from our clients about and networks about. I hear reasonable adjustments asked, questions about that quite a lot. So what's the most challenging adjustment request you've ever had to assess? Anybody want to share? If you don't want to share, I'm sure Alexandra and I have got from our archives of our careers some interesting ones. I've definitely had some fun things over the years. I'm just trying to think what I've had. Alexandra, have you got anything that pops to mind?
I won't say anything fun. I think probably just complex, probably quite a few under what we've just discussed around constant needs, constant changing needs that becomes quite complex and challenging. I probably have had some historically which were hard to fathom, but I can't.
I know I once had a request for a working chair that was £3,000, which is extraordinary.
Yeah.
Like, no, that's not feasible.
I think that comes from experience as well of where people have worked. So I think if people have come from larger organisations where that might be seen as something that could pass, then they don't think twice about the fact that somebody else, even if it's a smaller employer, would be able to do that.
I'd like £3,000 though on a chair. I mean, I'd want it to make me a cup of tea every day. I'd want it to do, type my emails. And £3,000. That's quite, that's quite the chair, right? So what makes an adjustment reasonable? Alexandra, to you.
There's no definitive list to what's reasonable. It depends on the factors, like, how effectiveness, basically, practicality, the cost impact, the business impact, the size and the resources of what the company has as well. The question around it is whether that adjustment or adjustments remove or reduce whatever disadvantage that person might be placed at as a result, without creating difficulties for the employer or the team.
Yeah, I think it's the balance, isn't it? It's striking the balance with what's reasonable, and understanding as well that particularly with a small employer, there isn't an endless pocket of money, so it's about understanding that you're going to try your best to support and give what you can, and of course if the revenue increases in the business you can give more, but at that point you can't, it's about what you can give. Do employers need a formal diagnosis before adjustments are considered? This is something we get really regularly, isn't it?
Yeah, no, people don't. Obviously, the duty for employers is under the Equality Act around providing reasonable adjustments, and that's where an individual would be classed as disabled. So when it comes to neurodiversity, it depends on the impact of the neurodiversity on the individual, who may well be classed as disabled for the purpose of the Equality Act, even if they don't have any formal diagnosis. It just depends on how it impacts them and their day-to-day lives. So the focus here again is around the conversation of what support might help, rather than can you prove you have a condition for us to be able to support you. It should never be that angle. It should just be the open conversation of what can we do to support you, how's this going to make things easier. But obviously when things do become complex, or when there's a bit more detail to it, then absolutely occupational health needs to come into play for you to be able to assess properly. And as part of that, it might be that medical evidence is needed as well from GPs or specialists and so on.
And occupational health can be, sometimes it's a good point, the occupational health thing, because sometimes people can see that as a sort of sounds like the police. Why are you sending me an occupational health? What are they looking for? But actually occupational health is really helpful because it's facts, right? It's the facts and it's the information that an employer can find out about and then act on. So it's not necessarily the police. It's definitely not a negative. It's there to support an individual to sort of establish a positive working relationship, really.
Yeah, plus they will be able to guide as to whether whatever the individual is going through is likely to be classed as a disability under the Equality Act or not, and therefore you'd be able to make a decision on like how far does this need to go, like in terms of the reasonable adjustments, which is an important factor as part of it, and knowing where you stand process wise and legally as well.
Yeah. Okay, does anyone have any sort of things they wanted to add before we move on to the next topic? Right, Isabel, I'm going to read your comment out if that's okay. I would love to know more about how to navigate an individual's responsibility to put measures in place that make it easier for them versus the impact on the wider team. Say a reasonable adjustment is in meetings being transcribed for the individual to read through in their own time versus the individual insisting on going through the transcript and during the meeting. This is a really good question, and I think this sort of speaks to that thinking environment piece. It's about perspective taking, isn't it? And it's also about how you set the boundaries and the tone for your working relationship. And certainly it's complex, that really, because there's layers, really. There's sort of the line manager sort of laying the boundaries with that individual, but there's also sort of a group sort of, how do we conduct ourselves in meetings, how do we conduct ourselves in sort of stand-ups or whatever it, you know, and on Slack and so on and so forth. So it's those sort of individual layers. It's certainly about when that gets in the way of good work, i.e., look, reading it out during the meeting isn't helpful for everyone. So can the line manager have a separate conversation to say, is there a reason behind that? Why do you need that transcription read out? And actually, if it's, you know, if there's good reason, that's useful, because that feeds back into the team dynamic on every level. But if there isn't a good reason, it's not about opinion and perception, it's more about kind of team dynamics. If there isn't a good kind of reason from that perspective, it's about understanding, well, how do we have a better conversation with that individual or individuals to make them help them understand the business context, the business purpose. And that's where things like, particularly with the conditions like neurodivergent conditions, there can be other conditions that go in parallel with it. So obviously we've got potentially higher levels of anxiety and depression, and of course anxiety can trigger other behaviors, so it can trigger a lot of control and a lot of need to keep safe, and that in itself is helping an individual, and it takes a lot of energy, doesn't it, then, to keep helping that individual to manage themselves in that setting. So it's, how do you build that trust, and how do you build that safety? That's it. Like I said, it's a huge topic, and perhaps one that we can do separately on another occasion. And I certainly think from the perspective taking, Isabel, it's something we're hearing a lot actually at the moment. And I think there's a lot of layers to this, as I said. But I think it's, you know, the other things that can run symbiotically with just that kind of neurodivergent label are things like rejection sensitivity. So if I hear messages, if I've got, let's say you've got an individual who's autistic, on an autistic spectrum, and they've got rejection sensitivity and they've got anxiety, any information that you give them is just going to trigger their anxiety for a start, but it's much deeper. They feel it much more deeply. So that space of actually helping someone understand is really, really quite difficult, right? In a very busy context of busy work, and remembering to check in all of those times. So there is a little bit of, how do you set the tone within the environment of your organization? And sometimes, and I think this is something we're seeing a lot, going back to those sort of age ranges in the workforce. There's an age range, myself included, that the language of this just wasn't something that was in our early career. So unless you're someone like me with firstly a massive curiosity, and secondly it's my job, you probably wouldn't necessarily seek to understand that information until you're at a crisis. And then of course, when you're in crisis response, you're not thinking compassionately, you're thinking, how do I resolve quickly this situation? So I think it's a topic, isn't it, that we could probably go into a little bit more deeply. Okay, and Sky, then let's speak to your lovely psychological safety work, which we will probably one day do lots of work on together, because that's my happy place too. Anyway, right, going back to this. Gender identity and the trans inclusion. I know this is the topic that gets quite a lot of controversy around it. It gets quite a lot of discussion. We're not going to discuss authors and their fame and their beliefs in systems. We're just going to focus on these questions. But if you do want to add anything, feel free to. So how confident do you feel advising managers on trans issues today? You can give me, if you want to put a score in the chat, like between 1 and say 5. So 1 is low, 5 is confident. Put something in there. What might you say? How confident do you feel in advising managers? on trans inclusion issues. Anyone else? Boorish. Yeah, I think that's pretty indicative. It's a really difficult. It's actually, I think, unless you've experienced it, even as an HR person, unless you've experienced it in so much as supporting an employee with either transition or post-transition, I think it's actually really, really difficult to understand, to have kind of a real life knowledge around this. So, Alexandra, sorry to put you on the spot again, but how can employers create a workplace that is inclusive of trans employees?
I think there's 3 key areas here. Starts with dignity, respect, and also consistency. You know, as employers, you don't need to have all the answers, and it is it's a changing space from the legal side of things as well. But you do need to have clear expectations around what respectful behaviour is, and how that impacts in the workplace. So it's not just, similar to everything else that we're going to discuss today, it's not just about having inclusive policies and guidance. Yes, it's important to have those there in the first place, but it's also making sure that managers are trained on having respectful conversations, that they have awareness around you know, what's going to be beneficial here, using correct names and pronouns, having human passports or something equivalent in place as well, for the team, so everyone's aware of preferences. Obviously things like reviewing facilities, dress codes, record keeping, things like that are important as well. Massive ones, obviously taking harassment or things like exclusion very seriously as well, and showing that there's a clear process and clear steps that the company does take for this. I think something that sometimes happens as well is making one trans employee almost responsible for educating others, because that's their experience. So it's avoiding that. It's not making them the example. You know, the aim here isn't to force everybody to try and think in the same way. It's making something so you've got an inclusive environment where people can work safely and respectfully and be themselves.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because I think actually, you know, not everyone is an extrovert and wants to tell the world their news. Some people are kind of quite like to be private about things, and even with something that's probably, you know, seemingly fairly obvious as a change, you know, changing genders, it's still your news. It's still there's still a dignity in not sharing kind of that story and all that information. It's effectively nobody's business. So it's about, you know, how do we create that dignity around that story and make sure that we know, we understand how to navigate it. And on the pronouns thing, that comes up quite a lot. One question that comes up a lot around that is, what if I get it wrong?
Yeah.
What's anybody's thoughts about that? Hayley, I'll read your question in a second, your answer in a second. What, you know, if you go by, you know, pronouns that are perhaps not seemingly as obvious, what's your thoughts? Has someone just put their hand up?
Sky.
It was me. Hello.
Hello. Sorry, I didn't see
My
it.
thoughts, as someone who uses they them pronouns but presents pretty feminine, can frequently get misgendered. I think that one of the things that is quite helpful for me is having other people who can help advocate, and because like for me it's like, 1, exhausting, and 2, oftentimes like I feel very anxious about trying to correct people, so other people being able to make that small correction on my behalf can be really helpful. And I think as well, from like a team training perspective, one of the things that happens a lot, especially if it's like a new change or people aren't super used to it, is like if they make the mistake, then they'll make it this huge thing of like, I'm so sorry, oh, it's so hard for me, like, oh, I'm really trying, like, blah, 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 blah. And like, it makes you want the floor to open up and like swallow you up. Like, it's really embarrassing. So I think when you do yeah, like start introducing that to the team, like kind of addressing that point as well. Like if you get it wrong, just correct yourself and move on. Something that someone said to me once as well is like a good way to correct yourself is if you say the sentence, like for example, you say like, I spoke to her about the project last week, and someone corrects you and says them. Instead of saying, oh yeah, them, and then carrying on the sentence, you should repeat back the whole sentence and say, I spoke to them about the project last week, because that helps train your brain better to use the right word, rather, because otherwise you're training your brain to say wrong pronoun, oops, correct pronoun. So yeah, that's my perspective. Also that Izzy put in the chat that when they're introducing me on email, they'll often just like pop my pronouns, like say, I'm leaping in sky, parentheses, pronouns, which can be helpful as well to avoid like issues of if you're in an email chain with someone for a really long time and they know you one way and then it's kind of like awkward to bring it up.
I think that's a really important point though, isn't it? It is advocacy, but it's also, there's also that, it's back to dignity, it's respecting you know, it's all, we all make mistakes, right? We all say, you know, unintentional things. It's about not making it a big kind of deal about us, but about having a little bit of a, oops, I made a mistake, sorry, and just moving on and having respect. I think it, you know, time and again, particularly in this conversation around inclusion, it comes back to that. What do we know about how much self-awareness we got? How much awareness have we got of others and our responsibility to others? And in a busy working environment, sometimes this isn't what we're thinking about. We're kind of thinking about getting our job done and sort of survival and in that respect. And sometimes those things sort of are the last thing on our mind. And it's about pushing that to the forefront a little bit more and saying, actually, you do have to have respect, because actually otherwise you're having grievances and problems that's part. Okay, so okay, we're going to move on to the next topic, but if anybody's got anything that they want to say on this or get in touch with, let us know. But Hayley, I was just going to read your point, wasn't I? We had an employee transition and change their name and pronouns. With their permission, we reintroduced them in the company meeting so that everyone met them and was aware of the change. Yeah, that's a lovely way to do things. I've seen that happen. I worked with someone who did exactly the same thing. It was lovely. It was really, really lovely. And when I had work experience of doing this, it was quite a long time ago. It's sort of 10, 11 years ago. And there was I worked in a big charity and they had sort of shared toilets. And they sort of talked about how they would handle the toilet situation. And it was quite in that meeting, and it was quite nice. I think things have changed moved on now, and unfortunately laws have confused things, but let's not go down that route, because we'll get lost in very upsetting conversations that make everybody all quite upset. So I don't want to do that today. We'll leave that for a conversation where we can have a scream into the wall. But so we're going to move on to religion and beliefs. Have you ever had two employees whose strongly held beliefs appeared to conflict with each other in the workplace? Anyone ever experienced that? I want to say football teams at this point might jump to mind. Alexandra, have you ever experienced any of that?
Not to the point where it became a problem. No, but again, I think then it's how it's dealt with. So that's what it comes down to. It's whether anything that happens is the behaviour that's being displayed a problem. Is it disrespectful? Is it potential misconduct? It depends obviously what the beliefs are about as well. So if they're protected, then it's a bit of a different matter. If it's just a general disagreement and people are behaving inappropriately, then that again is completely different to deal with. I don't think I've ever personally experienced anything where it could be, for example, like religion based, that's a clash. I know of many cases that have happened like this, but I've never dealt with one myself.
Yeah. Isabel, I'm calling you Isabel. Is it Isabel, or do you prefer Izzy?
I prefer Izzy. I don't know why it logs me in as Isabel, even though I changed it. I've previously worked in retail for a really long time. And most places I've worked had Eid celebrations, and that was always a point of contention within the wider store team for some people, because of the whole, it's the same during Pride Month, like, why isn't there straight Pride? Why do we celebrate just that? And that's caused some difficult conversations, but also, like Alexandra said, it's how you then deal with it. It's an opportunity to educate people on it rather than making it an argument, I think, which is what like managers have done in the past when it did happen, but I did witness some ugly arguments on it.
Yeah, and this is the one, I mean, in my earlier career, this is the one area that I saw a lot of issues bubble up about. I once had someone who was two Spanish workers, but one who spoke regular Spanish and one who spoke Catalan, and that turned into the most enormous argument over a customer service team that involved 60 people, lots of investigations. The HR team broke, you can imagine, but they effectively couldn't work together really in a customer service team. They had to be put on different shifts, all sorts of things. It was really, really challenging. And all that it is that kind of line between kind of addressing kind of, look, you do have differences, but actually you've got to work with, we've got to find a way. Sky.
When I worked in Saudi Arabia, obviously a lot of my colleagues were Muslim and would be fasting. And this was never like an issue. But I think it's like maybe a consideration. One of the things that we would do, those who weren't fasting, while we had colleagues who were, is that we would try to be a bit more considerate of them. So for example, where we might normally like have lunch in the manager office, we'd like go outside and have it elsewhere, especially if it was going to be like, you know, like hot food that smells and stuff like that. It wasn't ever something that was mandated, and it wasn't ever something that like the Muslim colleagues were asking for. But I think it is courteous. So that might be like, I think it's reasonable to suggest that maybe like if you do have colleagues to say like, hey, you can help out during this time by doing XYZ, so long as you're not like mandating it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of good practice around similar types of things that are implemented in companies, especially where there is perhaps like a larger Muslim community. Things like that. I mean, it shows that you're just exceptionally considerate to what other people are going through, which is really good and definitely should be exemplary for other people to follow. But yes, like we do see companies who do put in things like that. Like you say, not that's a mandate, but it's just a general awareness, and especially for managers to be aware and more considerate, because it's even how those times of fasting are going to impact how that person is when they are in work. They're going to be fatigued, they're going to be narky potentially because they've not eaten, they've not slept properly. They're therefore going to respond in ways that they're not normally responding. And it's making sure the manager has the skills to navigate those type of conversations and not take things personally when they might be snapped back at for a certain reason. But also, at what point does that need managing more effectively, and not using the fasting as an excuse for bad behavior as well?
Yeah, there's a line, isn't there? There is also around those sorts of times, kind of, well, generally, but specific to those times, sort of thinking about kind of prayer times. I remember working in an organisation where they just didn't have a prayer room, and I was like, hey, that's not, you know, you can't, that's not right, and created a space for people. So it is about being mindful that people have different, in that different religion space, that, you know, people will have different prayer times, different, you know, honor different traditions and rituals, and it's important to sort of respect that and not get in the way of that. Okay, sort of coming back to, I'll come back to the chat in a minute, but just coming back to sort of the things around adjustments and sort of moving on to sort of fairness and team dynamics. How would you explain to a team why one employee has a workplace adjustment and others don't? Does anyone want to share this before I quiz Alexandra, drill into her brain? Okay, Alexandra, over to you.
So obviously there's a matter of confidentiality here. Unless you've spoken with the employee and they are totally fine with details being disclosed, then it's not the employer or the manager's place to be discussing that with others. It's more the principle behind it of things are put in place to help individuals where necessary. It's not going into the details of what that is or why. It's not saying, you know, Alexandra needs this because of X, Y, and Z. It's just the principles behind like why it is and how it's going to make everybody's working lives a bit easier. And I think the impact there is making the rest of the team understand how it's actually going to benefit them as well. Because if you're putting things into place that are helping one person with a neurodivergency, for example, and that's going to better the working relationships in the team, it's going to better the outputs and the productivity and the ability to all collaborate, then ultimately everybody's winning at the end of that. Whereas if things are not communicated in the right way or not at all, then absolutely like some form of resentment can start building up, because people might just see, well, this person keeps getting X, Y, and Z. I don't get that. That's not fair. They're getting preferential treatment over me. And that's where problems start to arise. So there is communication that's needed around it, but it has to be done in the right way.
Yeah, why has that individual got a £3,000 chair and mine's only £200? Good question. I don't know. So what should leaders do when team tensions emerge around those inclusion initiatives, Alexandra?
I think quite a few inclusion initiatives can have a bit of a tension bit sometimes, depending on what it is, because also here it can be things like positive action programs that are put in potentially around hiring, for example. It can be, like we've touched upon before in discussion, around like single issue awareness campaigns that are companies driving. So this was literally like an example which was said, you know, if the company is quite strong on promoting things like International Women's Day, Pride Month, Black History Month, Neurodiversity Celebration Week, for example, people who don't fall into those categories might then be saying, well, where's all the inclusion for me? I don't fall into any of this. So they might be feeling that one specific group, for example, has been given an advantage or prioritized over others when that isn't the case. So again, it's the communication, it's how it's done in the company. If companies don't explain the distinction between removing barriers and helping those groups, then resentment can start to build. So I'd say, like, in terms of actions to take, I mean, it's not panicking when disagreements start occurring to start with. It doesn't mean that any initiatives that you're pushing out have failed. These type of initiatives, they're sensitive things because they're going to be touching on people's identity, their values, their beliefs, their experiences. So it's unrealistic to expect universal agreement between everyone or universal enthusiasm. It's just understanding why that initiative is creating that division. So is it more to do with confusion around why that initiative has been driven? Do people potentially feel excluded from the conversation that's happening around it? Like, have employees as a whole been involved in talking about what that initiative is going to be and how it's going to be rolled out, how it's going to impact them and what their thoughts are around it? Is there that perception that some groups are being prioritised over others? And if so, why, and how can you get around that? Is it around experiencing a bit of change fatigue, where they've seen lots of things being rolled out over time and not much happening from it. It could also be down to language as well. So is the language that's being used potentially alienating or a bit inaccessible maybe? So with it, as leaders, you should always be creating space for that honest feedback from people, including the feedback that might be quite uncomfortable to hear, because it's important to take all of that on board. But there really is that important distinction between a constructive challenge from people or from an individual versus disrespectful or discriminative behaviour. So if you are seeing that, it's obviously a completely different matter. People should be able to question and challenge and discuss any initiatives that are coming out without being labelled as resistant to the change or unsupportive. You know, their views should be heard as well. But equally, as an organisation, you should be clear that inclusion initiatives are ultimately about creating a workplace where people can thrive in it. It's not about compelling like agreement with a particular viewpoint as such.
I think it's sort of almost like a topic all of itself, but I think what's really sort of themes that I'm hearing in this space increasingly are people who don't feel that they've got a group to identify with, particularly interestingly white young men, are beginning to have challenges around the manosphere space. So whether they associate with that or not, they're really challenged with that because they don't feel that they've got a voice, and they don't feel that they've got a voice, and it's not just from women, it's from men, older men. So they don't feel that they've got a kind of a community that they belong to, if you like. And so the manosphere is a space of topic of conversation rather than something that they're necessarily like swinging towards, if you like. And the other thing on these things is that you can positively discriminate as well as negatively discriminate. So you can be in danger of sort of over-identifying people, almost over creating that kind of inclusion zone that is actually not inclusive at all. It's almost sort of, you know, over celebrating one particular community or a group of communities over someone else. It's about, and that's a very fine line to tread, and it's really difficult, and there's so much case law around that stuff that Alexandra and I could perhaps do something on that specifically at some point. But in that space you can also get sort of direct and indirect discrimination, and those are areas that we can perhaps pick up at another session. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to kind of move us towards the end of this, but do feel free to sort of come back to us with any kind of anything as we go on. So I'm just going to pick up on these two things now, because these are now going to be and are being included in the Employment Rights Act of 2025. And if you've missed that, sorry, but hi, I'm just going to lift the rock from where you've been because it's massive. So the menopause action plans are going to come out next year as a mandate, isn't that right, Alexandra?
Yeah.
And gender pay gap reporting is also changing under this legislation. These are for employers of over 250 people, but we suspect that this will be something that smaller organisations are going to sort of be required to follow suit from. If you like, the bigger ones will set the best practice, if you like, for the smaller ones over time, assuming that we stay in this lane and not move elsewhere. So let's just focus on that for a minute. So for any of you out there, if one of your strongest performers suddenly became less confident, less focused, started missing deadlines, became more forgetful, do you think that the menopause would be one of the first things considered in your organisation? No. No. There's a definite no there. That shake of that head was definitive. Alexandra, what would you say about ours? Yes. Crap.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because like most people would say no. It just wouldn't naturally enter, especially managers' minds, to think this could be the cause. But so many times it is, and there's still that stigma around talking about menopause as well. So you know, you're still getting employees who are not disclosing it, they're suffering in silence, and then their performance does dip and things change. Like it's almost like their personality seems to change as well, and then managers just see them as a problem, which is not okay. So it really should be something that's at the forefront of managers' minds, to think, you know, could this be something that's potentially affecting this individual? Obviously then how that conversation then transpires is can be tricky, especially if that person hasn't disclosed. It needs to be on that person to be comfortable enough to disclose that. And again, that's about creating the environment to make them comfortable, to have that trust and openness with their manager to actually talk about things. If that's in place to start with, I would hope that this would never be a situation where, you know, a manager would be looking at potential performance management. It would be more a conversation of, I know you're going through this, how can we support you with it?
I think it's important to say 75% of women experience severe, experience symptoms, of which a large percentage of those are severe. So 25% of women don't know that they are going through the menopause and sort of slip through it. I have complete envy, having been through it and totally oversharing publicly here. I can tell you, and Alexandra, God bless her, has loved me through this, but there are times when it's like a roller coaster. It's like an absolute roller coaster, and it's absolutely depleting, both in confidence but also brain power. Your brain just literally can't work. That's quite scary, actually. So I think it's important that we have something in that kind of space to understand that. I am going to move on now to just one final question, and that's sort of in the leadership and management capability space. What skills do you think managers need most then in 2026? Give us a quick answer. You can pop it in the chat or you can just speak up. I'd say better understanding of the law, actually. What skills do you think managers or leaders need most in 2026? I think it's probably better understanding of the law, and also stuff around kind of stepping back from our own responses to things and actually having a bit more kind of space for people. Building trust.
Yeah.
Or rebuilding, unfortunately. Yeah, I think that's very true. I think as an industry, the games industry, we are really good in many ways at this stuff, but there's a long way to go to get better, I think. A way to express that. How to have difficult conversations. It's not something you can do on a course. And then be good at it forever. Yeah, it's a skill, isn't it? It's a definite skill. It's a work in practice, isn't it? And you've got to be wanting to be good at it. I think you've got to want to invest in that change in your behaviour. Okay, with 1 minute to spare, we made it.